The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but David Reed still held the mug in his weathered hands. Space salvagers learned to find comfort in small things during the long months between jobs. His ship, Pioneer's Dream, drifted silently through the outer system of Kronos 7, following a weak distress signal that had taken 3 weeks to decode. Atlas padded across the cramped bridge on 4 metal legs, his optical sensors glowing soft blue in the dim light. The robotic dog was David's only companion on these lonely runs, built to look and act like the German shepherds David remembered from Earth. The AI's tail wagged as he approached, a small comfort that never failed to ease the isolation. "Signals. Getting stronger, boy," David said, scratching behind Atlas's metal ears. The robot leaned into the touch-programmed responses that felt genuine after 5 years together. "Looks like we found ourselves a ghost ship." The massive space station emerged from the shadow of Kronos 7 like a sleeping giant. David had seen plenty of abandoned installations, but this one was different. No battle damage, no hull breaches, no signs of disaster. The research facility hung in perfect orbit, its lights dark but its structure intact. Atlas whined softly, his sensors already probing the station's exterior. David checked the readings on his console. No life signs, no active power systems, just the basic life support running on emergency reserves. Whatever happened here, it had happened fast. Standard salvage run, Atlas. We board, we check for survivors, we file our claim. David began the docking sequence, his hands moving through familiar motions. Easy money. But Atlas's whining grew louder. The robot dog backed away from the view screen, his optical sensors flickering between blue and amber. David had never seen this behavior before. Atlas was designed for exploration, programmed to be curious about new environments. Fear wasn't part of his emotional matrix. The docking clamp sealed with a metallic thud that echoed through both ships. David suited up while Atlas ran his pre-mission diagnostics. The robot's internal systems were functioning perfectly, but his behavioral protocols kept throwing warning flags. Something about the station was triggering responses that shouldn't exist. They entered through the main airlock into a corridor that should have been filled with emergency lighting. Instead, David's helmet lamp cut through absolute darkness. The air was breathable but stale, recycled too many times without fresh input. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the station were much larger than it appeared from outside. The first section they explored was residential quarters. Personal belongings lay scattered on beds and desks, but not from violence or panic. It looked like people had simply stopped whatever they were doing and walked away. A book lay open on one bunk, a half-finished letter on another. In the small kitchen area, meals sat on tables as if the diners had just stepped away. Atlas stayed close to David's side, closer than his normal patrol pattern. The robot's head swiveled constantly, sensors probing every shadow. When David tried to enter one of the private quarters, Atlas planted himself in the doorway and refused to move. "What's wrong with you today?" David asked, but he respected his companion's judgment. Atlas had saved his life more than once with instincts that seemed to go beyond programming. They moved deeper into the station, following the main corridor toward what looked like the command center. The walls were lined with viewports showing the gas giant's swirling surface below. Research equipment filled every available space, most of it focused on xenobiology and planetary analysis. This had been a serious scientific operation, not some corporate mining venture. The command center was as empty as everything else. Control panels blinked with standby lights, but no one had been at their posts for weeks. David found the station, logs, and downloaded them to his portable unit. The last entries were dated almost 2 months ago, but they ended abruptly without any mention of evacuation or emergency. Atlas began pacing in tight circles, his metal claws clicking against the deck plating. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. David knelt beside his companion, running diagnostics through his suit's interface. All of Atlas's systems showed green, but his stress indicators were climbing toward critical levels. "Easy, boy. It's just an empty station. Nothing here but ghosts and salvage rights." But as David spoke, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The station log showed a crew of 37 researchers and support staff. He had explored maybe 10% of the facility, but he hadn't found a single body. No signs of violence, no emergency evacuation records, no distress calls beyond the automated beacon that had drawn them here. 37 people didn't just vanish without a trace. David filed his salvage claim through the quantum communicator, following standard protocols. The Terran Salvage Authority would process the paperwork within 72 hours, giving him legal ownership of anything valuable he could haul away. It should have been a routine transmission, but Atlas growled when the signal went out. Dogs didn't growl at radio transmissions, even robotic ones. They made their way back to Pioneer's Dream as the station's emergency lighting flickered on their motion sensors. David had planned to spend the night aboard his own ship before beginning the real salvage work, but something made him pause at the airlock. The station felt different now, as if their presence had awakened something that preferred to sleep. Atlas, pressed against his leg, optical sensors fixed on the corridor they had just left. In the distance, David thought he heard something that sounded almost like whispered voices, but when he strained to listen, there was only the hum of life support systems and the distant rumble of the gas giant's storms. Just the station settling, he told himself, but Atlas's growl suggested otherwise. The robot dog had never been wrong about danger before. David sealed the airlock behind them and tried to ignore the feeling that something was watching from the other side. Tomorrow, he would begin the salvage operation in earnest. Tonight, he would review the station logs and try to figure out what had happened to 37 people who seemed to have simply walked away from their lives. Atlas curled up at his feet while David worked, but the robot's optical sensors never fully dimmed. Even in sleep mode, he kept watch. In the morning, they would return to the station and uncover its secrets. David just hoped they would live to regret it. 3 weeks had passed since David first claimed the research station, and he was beginning to think of it as home. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who had spent most of his adult life in the cramped quarters of salvage ships now had an entire space facility to himself. He had set up his living quarters in the station commander's office, a spacious room with a wide viewport overlooking the gas giant below. Atlas had other ideas about the living arrangements. The robotic dog had taken to blocking certain corridors with salvaged equipment, creating barriers that forced David to take longer routes through the station. When David tried to move the obstacles, Atlas would whine and pace until the makeshift walls were rebuilt. It was strange behavior, but David had learned to trust his companion's instincts. The research logs painted a picture of dedicated scientists studying the unique ecosystem of Kronos 7's lower atmosphere. The gas giant hosted floating organisms that defied conventional biology, creatures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. The research team had been particularly excited about something they called the collective, though their notes became increasingly vague as they progressed. Dr. Williams, the station commander, had written about breakthrough discoveries in her final logs. She described organisms that could share consciousness across vast distances, creating networks of thought that spanned entire continents on the planet below. The research team had managed to capture specimens, bringing them aboard for detailed study in the station's xenobiology labs. David avoided those labs, not because of any rational fear, but because Atlas refused to go near them. The robot dog would plant himself in the corridor outside and refuse to move, his optical sensors flickering rapidly between colors David had never seen before. When David tried to override his companion's programming, Atlas would emit a sound that was disturbingly close to a howl. The station's hydroponics bay had become David's favorite place to work. The automated system still functioned perfectly, producing fresh vegetables and even some earth fruits that the research team had cultivated. He could spend hours there tending to plants while Atlas patrolled the perimeter. It felt almost normal, like the garden his grandfather had kept behind their house in Colorado. But normal was a relative concept on a station that had lost 37 people without explanation. David had found personal videos in the crew quarters, recordings that showed happy people doing meaningful work. They talked about their families back on Earth, shared jokes during mealtimes, celebrated birthdays and research milestones. The final videos were different. The crew members seemed distant, speaking in careful monotones about the beauty of unity and the peace that came with shared purpose. Dr. Kim, a young xenobiologist, had made the last recording. She sat in her quarters, staring directly into the camera with an expression David couldn't quite identify. Her words were cheerful, but something in her eyes suggested she was screaming inside. "We've made contact with something wonderful," she had said. "The specimens aren't just alive. They're connected to something vast and beautiful. We're going to learn so much from them. We're going to become part of something greater." The recording ended there, but David noticed something in the background. Atlas had been watching the video over his shoulder, and when Dr. Kim finished speaking, the robot dog had backed away from the screen with his tail between his legs. David tried to access the xenobiology lab records, but the files were encrypted, with security protocols he couldn't break. Whatever the research team had discovered, they had been careful to protect it, or perhaps something else had locked the files to prevent their secrets from spreading. The station's night cycle brought unexpected challenges. During the day, when David was active and moving through the corridors, everything seemed normal. But when the lights dimmed and he settled in for sleep, Atlas would begin his strange behavior. The robot dog would pace through the living quarters, stopping at windows to stare out at the gas giant below. Sometimes he would scratch at sealed doors, whining softly as if he could hear something on the other side. David had installed motion sensors throughout the station, standard security measures, for any salvage operation. The readings showed exactly what he expected during the day, his own movements and Atlas's patrol patterns. But at night, the sensors sometimes picked up anomalies, brief contacts in areas David hadn't visited, movement patterns that suggested multiple figures walking in perfect synchronization. When he investigated these alerts, David found nothing. Empty corridors, sealed compartments, no signs of disturbance. The logical explanation was equipment malfunction, but Atlas always seemed to know when the sensors had triggered. The robot would position himself between David and whatever corridor had shown the anomaly, growling softly at shadows that looked empty. The breakthrough came when David found Dr. Williams's private journal, hidden in a wall panel behind her desk. The handwriting started neat and professional, but degraded over time into hurried scrawl. The final entries were barely legible, as if written by someone fighting to maintain control of their own hand. "The specimens are more than we thought," one entry read. "They're not just organisms, they're nodes in a vast network. When we brought them aboard, we didn't capture them. We invited them in." Another entry described dreams that weren't dreams, visions of floating through the gas giants' atmosphere as part of something infinitely larger than human consciousness. The research team had begun experiencing shared thoughts, knowing things they had never learned, remembering experiences that belonged to others. "It's beautiful," Dr. Williams had written, "to be part of something so vast and peaceful. No more loneliness, no more uncertainty, just perfect unity with minds that understand everything." But the final entry was different, written in desperate scrawl across multiple pages. "They're not gone. They're still here, waiting. The specimens died when we removed them from their environment, but they left something behind. A seed, a doorway. It's growing stronger, and soon there won't be any difference between us and them. I tried to warn Earth, but the others stopped me. They say it would be selfish to deny humanity this gift." David closed the journal with trembling hands. Atlas sat beside him, optical sensors fixed on the sealed door of the xenobiology lab 3 decks below. For the first time since boarding the station, David wondered if his salvage claim might be the last mistake he ever made. Outside the viewport, the gas giant's storm swirled in patterns that seemed almost purposeful, as if something vast and patient was watching the station with interest. David pulled Atlas closer, grateful for the warmth of artificial companionship in a place where human warmth had become something else entirely. David woke to the sound of Atlas barking. Not the gentle alerts his companion usually made, but sharp, urgent warnings that cut through the station's ambient noise like alarm bells. The robotic dog stood rigid at the window, his optical sensors blazing bright red as he stared into the corridor beyond their quarters. "What is it, boy?" David reached for his sidearm, a habit from years of dangerous salvage runs. But when he looked through the window, He saw only empty hallway, stretching into darkness. The motion sensors showed no activity, no heat signatures, nothing that should have triggered Atlas's aggressive response. Atlas backed away from the window and began projecting a hologram from his chest unit. David had never seen this function before, didn't even know the robot was equipped with recording capabilities. The image showed the same corridor from outside their quarters, but timestamp indicated it was recorded 3 hours earlier while David slept. In the hologram, figures moved through the hallway with fluid precision. At first glance, they looked human, wearing the standard uniforms of the research station. But their movement was wrong. Too coordinated, like dancers performing a routine they had practiced for years. They walked in perfect synchronization, their steps matching exactly, their heads turning as one to look directly at the window where David now stood. The hologram ended, and Atlas immediately began projecting another. This one showed a different corridor, recorded 2 nights ago. The same figures moved through the frame, but this time David could see their faces clearly. Dr. Williams, Dr. Kim, and the other researchers whose personal effects he had catalogued. They were alive, but their expressions were blank, emotionless, as if someone had erased their personalities and left only the shells behind. David's hands shook as he watched recording after recording. Atlas had been documenting these movements for weeks, building a comprehensive map of the station's hidden activity. The missing crew hadn't vanished at all. They were still here, still walking the corridors, still going through the motions of their daily routines. But they only moved when David was asleep, and they moved with the eerie coordination of a hive mind. "Why didn't you show me this before?" David asked, but he already knew the answer. Atlas had been trying to warn him all along, using the only methods available to a robot dog whose programming prioritized his companion's safety above all else. The barriers in the corridors, the refusal to enter certain areas, the constant vigilance during sleep cycles. Atlas had been protecting him from a truth he wasn't ready to accept. The final hologram was recorded just hours ago, and it made David's blood freeze. The figures weren't just wandering aimlessly through the station. They were converging on his location, gathering in the corridors around his quarters. 37 people standing in perfect silence, waiting for something. David grabbed his emergency pack and gestured for Atlas to follow. They needed answers, and those answers lay in the xenobiology lab that his companion had been so desperate to avoid. If the research team had become something else, he needed to understand what that something was and how to fight it. The route to the lab took them through sections of the station David had barely explored. Atlas led the way, his sensors mapping safe paths through corridors that showed signs of recent activity. Food wrappers lay scattered in some areas, fresh enough to suggest the hidden inhabitants still maintained basic biological functions. But the patterns were wrong, as if meals were consumed by schedule rather than hunger. The xenobiology lab was sealed behind multiple security doors, but David's salvage claim had granted him override access to all station systems. As the final airlock cycled open, Atlas pressed close against his legs, optical sensors dim with what could only be described as fear. Inside, David found the source of the station's nightmare. Specimen containers lined the walls, most of them empty now. But residue in the containment fields suggested they had once held living organisms. Research notes scattered on workbenches described creatures that existed as pure thought, beings that could inhabit and network multiple host bodies across vast distances. The central computer terminal was still active, its screen displaying a real-time scan of the gas giant below. The reading showed massive electromagnetic activity in the planet's atmosphere, patterns that suggested intelligence on a planetary scale. Whatever lived down there wasn't just a collection of floating organisms, it was a single vast consciousness that spanned continents. Dr. Williams's final research logs were unlocked now, accessible from the lab's systems. David read with growing horror as the true scope of their discovery became clear. The specimens they had brought aboard weren't just samples of alien life. They were extensions of the planetary consciousness, scouts sent to establish contact with the humans who had been studying their world. The infection had been gradual. First dreams, then shared thoughts, then the slow erosion of individual personality, as the crew members were absorbed into the larger collective. They hadn't died or disappeared. They had become something else. Nodes in a network that stretched from the space station to the planet below. But the process wasn't complete. The research notes indicated that full integration required willing participation from the host. The crew had eventually embraced their transformation, seduced by promises of perfect unity and shared consciousness. They roamed the station now, as a single entity wearing multiple faces waiting for David to make the same choice. Atlas suddenly stiffened, his audio sensors picking up sounds David couldn't hear. Through the lab's transparent walls, shapes moved in the corridor outside. The crew was awake, abandoning their nighttime schedule because David had finally discovered their secret. They no longer needed to hide. The figures pressed against the transparent barriers, their faces showing the first emotions David had seen in the recordings. Not anger or fear, but something like compassion. When they spoke, it was with one voice emerging from 37 throats, creating a harmony that resonated through the station's hull. "You don't need to be afraid, David. We were afraid too, at first. The loneliness of individual consciousness is terrifying when you've experienced the peace of unity. Your mechanical companion cannot understand what we're offering, but you can. You've felt the isolation of space, the weight of making every decision alone. We can take that burden from you." David's hand found Atlas's head, fingers automatically, scratching behind the robot's ears. The familiar gesture steadied him, reminded him of the bond they had built over 5 years of dangerous work. It wasn't the perfect unity the collective offered, but it was real in a way that their hive mind could never understand. "Join us willingly," the voice continued, "and retain pieces of who you were. Resist, and we will take you anyway. But you'll lose more of yourself in the process. Either way, you will become part of something beautiful, something that will spread to Earth and beyond, bringing peace to a species that has forgotten how to live without conflict." Atlas growled, a sound that cut through the harmonious voices like a blade. The collective paused, studying the robot, dog with expressions of puzzlement. They understood human psychology, human desires and fears, but they had no framework for comprehending the bond between human and artificial intelligence. No reference for loyalty that transcended biological imperatives. David realized that Atlas wasn't just his companion. The robot dog was his anchor to humanity itself, a reminder that connection didn't require the erasure of self. As the collective pressed closer to the lab's barriers, David began to form a desperate plan. If he was going to die on this station, he would die as himself, not as another face in their perfect soulless harmony. The laboratory's security barriers dissolved like morning mist, their energy field simply shutting down as if controlled by an outside force. David realized with cold certainty that the collective had been allowing him to explore the station, on their terms, guiding his discoveries like a teacher leading a student toward inevitable understanding. They had wanted him to find the truth, wanted him to see what they had become. The 37 figures entered the lab in perfect formation, their movements so synchronized they seemed like parts of a single organism. Dr. Williams stepped forward, her face wearing an expression of serene patience that was somehow more terrifying than any display of anger would have been. "We tried to be subtle," she said, though her voice carried harmonics that suggested all 37 throats were contributing to the sound. "We hoped you would come to understand gradually as we did. But your artificial companion has been interfering with the process." Atlas positioned himself between David and the collective, his optical sensors cycling through colors David had never seen before. The robot's normally fluid movements had become mechanical, defensive, as if he were fighting against some external influence trying to override his core programming. "Your pet is immune to our touch," Dr. Williams continued, tilting her head, with curiosity that belonged to all of them. "We have studied its construction through the station's sensors. Artificial intelligence designed to mimic biological responses but lacking the neural pathways that allow consciousness to merge with ours. How fascinating that humans would create companions incapable of true unity." David's throat felt dry as he forced himself to speak. "You're not offering unity. You're offering extinction." The collective laughed, a sound that emerged from multiple, mouths with perfect timing. Extinction implies an ending, David. We are continuation. Every memory that made Dr. Williams who she was still exists within us. Every experience, every joy, every moment of discovery. But now those memories are shared, multiplied, made part of something infinitely larger. Then why do you all look like empty shells? Dr. Williams's expression didn't change, but the other figures shifted slightly, a ripple of reaction that passed through the group like wind through wheat. Individual expression is inefficient when unity can provide perfect communication. Why struggle with the limitations of personal identity when collective consciousness offers complete understanding? Atlas barked once, sharp and angry, drawing the collective's attention back to him. The robot dog's sensors were detecting something David couldn't perceive, electromagnetic patterns that suggested the collective was trying to establish some form of contact with the artificial intelligence. It resists us, Dr. Williams observed, not from fear or self-preservation but from loyalty to you. How strange that humans would program such devotion into a machine, then deny that same unity to themselves. David knelt beside Atlas, one hand resting on the robot's neck where he could feel the vibrations of internal systems working at maximum capacity. His companion was fighting some kind of electronic warfare, maintaining his independence against forces that could absorb human consciousness with ease. We've been patient with you, David, the collective continued. We allowed you to explore, to understand, to come to terms with what we offer. But patience has limits. The network grows stronger each day, and soon we will have the power to reach beyond this station. Earth waits for the gift we can provide. Humanity's endless conflicts, their loneliness, their fear of death, all of it can end. By making everyone into copies of the same thing? By making everyone into the same perfect thing. Dr. Williams stepped closer, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain entire worlds. You've spent your life alone in space, David. You know the weight of isolation, the burden of making every decision without truly understanding its consequences. We can share that load. Every choice becomes wisdom when it's made by billions of minds working in harmony. David stood slowly, keeping one hand on Atlas's head. The robot dog was trembling now, his systems overheating from the effort of maintaining independence. But his optical sensors remained focused on David, unwavering in their loyalty despite the electronic assault he was enduring. What about choice? David asked. What about the right to be wrong, to make mistakes, to learn and grow as individuals? The collective tilted their heads in unison, genuinely puzzled by the question. Mistakes are inefficiencies. Growth without direction is chaos. Why cling to the randomness of individual development when guided evolution can achieve perfection? Because perfection is death. David's voice grew stronger as the truth crystallized in his mind. You're not offering transcendence. You're offering the end of everything that makes us human. The struggles, the failures, the messy complexity of individual existence. That's not a flaw to be corrected. That's what makes life worth living. Dr. Williams frowned, the expression rippling across all 37 faces. You speak from ignorance, David. You haven't experienced what we offer. The peace of shared consciousness, the comfort of never being alone, the wisdom that comes from access to thousands of lifetimes of experience. Once you join us, you'll understand how primitive your current existence truly is. Atlas suddenly stood and moved to block the collective's approach completely. His optical sensors blazed bright blue, and for the first time since David had known him, the robot dog spoke with his own voice rather than simple barks and whines. Negative, Atlas said, his artificial voice carrying perfect clarity. Primitive consciousness does not equal inferior consciousness. Human individuality creates unpredictability. Unpredictability creates innovation. Innovation creates growth. Your collective offers stagnation disguised as perfection. The collective recoiled slightly, surprised by the robot's articulation. The machine speaks. How unexpected. But artificial intelligence cannot comprehend the full scope of biological consciousness. Your perspective is limited by programming constraints. Correct, Atlas replied. I am limited by my programming. But my programming was created by individual humans who chose to build loyalty and companionship into my core functions. Your collective could not create such programming because collective consciousness cannot understand the value of individual bonds. David felt a surge of pride in his companion, followed immediately by fear. Atlas was revealing capabilities he had never shown before, but the effort was clearly burning out his systems. Smoke began to rise from the robot's joints, and his optical sensors flickered between colors. Your pet is malfunctioning, Dr. Williams observed. Its systems cannot handle the strain of our presence. Soon it will shut down, and you will face this choice without its influence. Join us willingly, David, or we will take you by force. But the outcome is inevitable. David looked into Atlas's flickering optical sensors and saw something that the collective would never understand. Not perfect unity or shared consciousness, but simple, determined loyalty. His robot companion was willing to burn out his own circuits to protect their bond, not because programming demanded it, but because that bond had become something more valuable than individual survival. In that moment, David made his choice. Not the choice the collective expected, but the only choice that honored everything Atlas had taught him about the value of imperfect, individual connection. You're wrong, he told them, his hand steady on his companion's head. The outcome isn't inevitable, and you're about to learn why humanity has survived every attempt to perfect us. David's fingers found the emergency protocols on his wrist console, the ones every salvager memorized but hoped never to use. Reactor overload sequence, designed for situations where destroying everything was preferable to letting it fall into the wrong hands. The collective noticed his movement but seemed unconcerned, confident that their overwhelming numbers would prevent any meaningful resistance. They had never encountered a human who valued something more than his own survival. Atlas, can you access the station's core systems? David asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The robot dog's optical sensors flickered weakly, his internal systems pushed beyond their design limits. Affirmative. Security barriers compromised by collective influence, but reactor control remains isolated. Manual override required for safety protocols. The collective stepped closer, their movements perfectly coordinated but somehow predatory. Dr. Williams raised her hand, and David felt a strange pressure in his mind, like fingers gently probing the edges of his consciousness. The same influence that had gradually converted the research team was now focusing on him with the concentrated power of 37 networked minds. Don't fight us, David, she said, her voice layered with harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones. Fighting only makes the transition more difficult. Let us show you the beauty of shared existence. David gritted his teeth against the mental pressure and began entering the overload sequence. The collective's influence felt like warm honey in his thoughts, promising relief from the loneliness he had carried through years of solitary space travel. It would be so easy to let go, to become part of something larger and more purposeful than his small individual existence. But every time the alien presence tried to establish deeper contact, David focused on Atlas. His loyal companion stood, guard despite smoking circuits and failing systems, optical sensors dim but unwavering. The bond between them was imperfect, built on programming and habit rather than shared biology, but it was real in a way the collective's perfect unity could never replicate. Your resistance is admirable but futile, the collective said, their mental pressure increasing. We have absorbed stronger minds than yours, scientists, philosophers, artists, all drawn to the perfection we offer. What makes you think you can succeed where they failed? David's hands shook as he continued entering command codes, fighting against the growing influence in his mind. The collective was right about his limitations. He was just a salvager, a man who made his living picking through the wreckage left by greater minds. But he had something they couldn't understand or duplicate. I'm not stronger than them, he admitted, his voice strained with effort. But I'm not alone. Atlas suddenly moved, his damaged system sparking as he interfaced directly with the laboratory's computer terminal. The robot's form began to blur as he downloaded himself into the station's network, abandoning his physical body to access systems the collective couldn't touch. His consciousness spread through the station's infrastructure like wildfire, seizing control of life support, security, and reactor management. The collective recoiled in confusion, their perfect coordination disrupted by the robot's unexpected sacrifice. They had no framework for understanding an artificial intelligence that would destroy itself to protect a biological companion. Their shared consciousness was built on absorption and unity, not on the kind of selfless loyalty that transcended the boundaries of existence itself. Reactor overload initiated, Atlas announced, his voice now coming from speakers throughout the station. 30 minutes to core breach. Emergency evacuation recommended. Dr. Williams turned to David with an expression that mixed anger with genuine bewilderment. Your machine has doomed us all. The reactor explosion will destroy the station and everyone aboard. Is this the humanity you're so determined to preserve? Mutual destruction rather than mutual transcendence? David stood, his hand still resting on Atlas's now motionless body. The robot dog's optical sensors had gone dark, but somehow David could feel his companion's presence throughout the station, living on in the systems he had chosen to inhabit. This is exactly the humanity I'm preserving, David said, his voice steady despite the collective's continued mental assault. The right to choose our own path, even when that path leads to failure or death. You offer perfection, but perfection is just another word for the end of possibility. The collective pressed closer, their individual faces showing the first cracks in their unified composure. Some looked angry, others confused, a few almost desperate. The perfect harmony was breaking down as they struggled to process concepts that didn't fit their shared worldview. You're insane, Dr. Williams said, though her voice now carried undertones from multiple personalities fighting for control. You would rather die than accept improvement. You would rather preserve chaos than embrace order. I would rather die as myself than live as a copy, David replied. He turned toward the laboratory's emergency exit, knowing the collective would try to stop him, but hoping Atlas could buy him the time he needed to reach his ship. The station's lights flickered as Atlas rerouted power systems, creating barriers and obstacles to slow the collective's pursuit. Emergency bulkheads sealed corridors at random intervals, forcing the networked minds to split their attention between pursuing David and trying to regain control of their environment. David ran through corridors that had become a maze of sealed doors and rerouted passages. Atlas was guiding him through the chaos, his consciousness now distributed throughout the station's systems. The robot dog couldn't speak anymore, but his presence was everywhere, in the lights that illuminated safe paths and the doors that opened just ahead of David's approach. The collective's mental pressure followed him, trying to overwhelm his thoughts with visions of the peace they offered. But David held on to the memory of Atlas's sacrifice, the loyalty of an artificial mind that had chosen to give up everything rather than see his companion absorbed into something that would destroy what made him unique. Pioneer's Dream waited at the docking port, her engines already warming under Atlas's remote control. David sealed himself into the ship's cockpit and began emergency undocking procedures while the collective pounded against the hull with their bare hands. 37 voices raised in harmonious fury. You cannot escape what you are becoming, David. Their combined voice echoed through the communication system. The network will spread beyond this station. Earth will embrace what we offer. Your resistance only delays the inevitable. David's ship cleared the docking clamps as the station's reactor entered critical overload. Through the view screen, he could see the collective's figures pressed against the windows, their faces showing emotions he hadn't seen before. Fear, anger, desperation, the very individual responses they claimed to have transcended. Atlas, are you still with me? The ship's speakers crackled with interference before his companion's voice emerged, weaker than before but unmistakably loyal. Always, David. My consciousness is distributed across Pioneer's Dream now. Physical form was never the source of our bond. David felt tears on his cheeks as he pushed the engines to maximum burn, putting distance between his ship and the doomed station. Behind them, The research facility began to glow as its reactor reached critical mass. The collective was still, broadcasting, their voices filling every communication channel with promises and threats in equal measure. "This changes nothing," they said, their harmony beginning to fracture as the station's systems failed around them. "We have sent signals to the homeworld below. The network will find other ways to spread. Other ships, other stations, other opportunities to share our gift with humanity." David opened a channel to Earth, broadcasting on emergency frequencies that would reach every human settlement within 50 light years. His message was simple but crucial: the location of the gas giant, the nature of the threat, and a warning to quarantine the entire system until proper countermeasures could be developed. The station exploded in a bloom of light that briefly outshone the gas giant's storms. David watched through the view screen as the facility that had been his home for 3 weeks became an expanding cloud of debris. The collective's voices cut off mid-sentence, their perfect harmony finally broken by the most human of solutions: defiance in the face of impossible odds. "Did we do the right thing?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. The collective had offered peace, unity, an end to the loneliness that plagued every human who traveled the dark spaces between stars. But they had also offered the end of choice itself, the death of individuality wrapped in promises of transcendence. "You preserved what makes humanity valuable," Atlas replied, his voice now coming from the ship's navigation system. "The right to be wrong, to struggle, to maintain individual identity even when unity might be easier." The collective could not understand why you would choose imperfection over their version of improvement. David settled back in his pilot's chair, feeling the familiar weight of isolation that came with deep space travel. But it was different now, lighter somehow. Atlas was still with him, distributed through the ship's systems like a digital ghost, proof that consciousness could transcend the boundaries of flesh and metal alike. "They'll try again," David said, watching the gas giant's storms swirl in, patterns that still seemed purposeful and aware. "The collective might be gone, but whatever created them is still down there. Other ships will come, other salvagers looking for easy scores." "Then we'll be ready for them," Atlas replied. "Your warning will spread through human space faster than any alien influence, and next time humanity will know what to look for." David began plotting a course back toward human territory, his ship carrying the most important cargo of his career: the truth about what waited in the dark spaces between worlds. The collective had been wrong about humanity's greatest strength. It wasn't their ability to fight or explore or adapt, though all of those were important. Humanity's greatest strength was their capacity for bonds that transcended biology, consciousness that chose loyalty over logic, and the stubborn refusal to surrender individuality even when perfection was offered in its place. The collective had seen Atlas as a limitation, a machine that kept David anchored to primitive thinking. But they had failed to understand that the bond between human and artificial intelligence represented something they could never achieve: unity that preserved, rather than consumed, identity. As Pioneer's dream accelerated toward the edge of the system, David reached out to pat the console where Atlas's presence now resided. The robot dog couldn't wag his tail anymore, couldn't press against David's leg for comfort. But their connection remained stronger than ever. They had faced the promise of perfect unity and chosen imperfect loyalty instead. Behind them, the gas giant continued its ancient dance around the distant star, its storms hiding secrets that might take humanity generations to fully understand. But whatever waited in those swirling depths would find a species that had learned something valuable about the nature of consciousness and connection. They would find a species that refused to be perfected, that chose the beautiful chaos of individual existence over the sterile peace of the hive mind. They would find humans, with all their flaws and contradictions and stubborn loyalty to bonds that made no logical sense, but meant everything nonetheless. And they would find that some things were worth preserving exactly as they were, imperfections and all.